Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today we're going to be talking about Scholar in Shadowbringers. Very quickly before we get into the video, I want to apologize if the video quality is a little bit less than usual. I forgot to record the gameplay yesterday as I was streaming, so I decided to take the gameplay from stream instead from the Twitch VOD. So the video quality could be a little bit less than the usual. Now, when it comes down to playing Scholar, it has always been my favorite healer over the last few years. I started healing back in Heavensward because that's where I started playing, and it was my favorite healer at endgame. Same thing for Stormblood. Scholar has always been my favorite. Now, going into Shadowbringers, this didn't necessarily change all that much. It's just that the other two healers are a lot more fun to play to me right now than they were in the previous expansions. Scholar is still definitely my go-to though, whenever I go into 8-man content, and the reason being is because Scholar is a mitigation beast. When it comes down to playing the other two healers, you still have access to some sort of mitigation, but you're mostly relying on the rest of your team to help you out with mitigating raid-wide damages, and then of course tank busters and such as well. Whereas if you're playing Scholar, you can actually take that role upon yourself for the majority of times as well, so you don't have to rely as much on the rest of your party. Of course, in certain fights, mitigating raid-wide AoEs will be a lot more important than others, especially if you're not doing it when you're fully best in slot and you're playing with people that know what they are doing. Now, of course, because Scholar has so much mitigation in their kit, there is also a trade-off, and that is that they don't have the same amount of spammable heals that the other healers have. If you look at, for example, White Mage and Astrologian, they both have a strong spammable single target heal, and they also both have a spammable AoE heal. Now, when it comes down to Scholar, they don't really have that. Their spammable single target heal is a very weak one called Physic, which is something that as soon as you unlock Adloquium, you don't really want to use this ever because it feels really bad. It is a very weak heal and it doesn't really do that much. Now, when it comes down to the other two heals that they have access to, Succor and Adloquium, these are more potent heals, but the problem is that half of that heal's potency will be applied as a shield instead, so Adloquium being your single target and Succor being your AoE. So if you're just going to be spamming these two skills, when the shield is still there, that's basically half of your heal going to waste. Now, luckily enough, we do have a skill called Emergency Tactics. This one is on a 15-second cooldown, so relatively short cooldown, which will basically transform the shield of these abilities into an extra heal instead. So even though you don't have the heals on demand like the other two healers do, we do have Emergency Tactics every 15 seconds to basically have a little bit of the same. So you can just like shield with the Succor once and then use Emergency Tactics to just heal up and not get the shielding from it. Just to give an example. Now, that's basically everything that we have when it comes down to our GCD heals. A very weak single target heal, an AoE heal that also shields, and a strong single target heal plus shield as well. Now, the cool thing about Adloquium is that when it crits, it actually gives you two shields instead. Back in the day, crit adlos were very strong because of another skill that we have called deployment tactics, which would basically spread the Adloquium to your nearby party members. But whenever you would crit an Adlo back in the day, it would basically be one gigantic shield, and if you would then spread that shield to the rest of your party through using deployment tactics, you had an incredibly strong shield. So much mitigation that they decided to nerf it going into Shadowbringers, and now giving you two different shields. The Galvanized shield from the Adlo, and then the crit shield would turn into Catalyze. So when you use deployment tactics on this shield, you basically only spread the Galvanize effect, so that Scholar doesn't feel as incredibly powerful as it did back then with the crit adlos. Also makes it so that you don't necessarily want to fish for crit adlos anymore for specific parts of the fight. Now, of course, fishing for crit adlos is something that you don't necessarily have to do anymore because we also got a new skill called Recitation, which will guarantee you a crit on your adlo, but we'll talk about that one in just a second. Now, when it comes down to dealing damage on Scholar, fairly simple. It's the same as with all the other healers. We have Broil for our single target, we have Biolysis, which is our damage over time effect, lasts 30 seconds, and then we have Art of War, which is our spammable AoE skill, comes from an AoE around you, and it's also an instant cast skill, so allowing you to use a lot of off-global cooldowns, because Scholar doesn't really have that many GCD heals, but it has a load of off-global cooldown heals that we can use instead. And some of these will be coming from our Aetherflow system, and some of these will be coming from our Fairy, because Scholar is a pet job, so we do have a Fairy where a lot of our healing will be coming from. So we'll talk about the Fairy first. So we have a couple of different things that we have available to us. First of all, we have Embrace. This is basically a regen effect. This is the Fairy's auto heal that is always going to be using, and it will be cast constantly as long as people are missing HP. You don't have to press any buttons for the fairy to do this. Whenever she isn't doing anything else, she'll be casting Embrace on a random party member. Can be a little bit unfortunate because back in the day you could force them to cast Embrace on, for example, the tank that would need it the most. Right now it will just use Embrace on whoever is missing HP. Outside of that, we still have two more fairy skills, which is Whispering Dawn. This is an AoE regen effect, and we have Fey Illumination. This is both a 10% healing buff to you and your party members, and also a 5% magic mitigation buff. So it's kind of like a 2-in-1. It'll make your shields stronger if you cast the shield during this healing buff, and it will also grant you a little bit of mitigation. Now, last but not least, we also have the Saraf. This is our level 80 skill. We can basically transform our fairy into a Saraf, and then our Embrace effect is still there, but it's called a little bit different. I forget the name, but it's basically a stronger Embrace. It will also shield that target, so it's both a heal and a shield. And then we can also activate a skill called Consolation, which is an AoE heal and shield. Now, the cool thing about this shield is that it will also stack with your sucker shields. So if you really need a lot of mitigation for something, you can use the Consolation on top of your normal sucker shields to basically mitigate a lot of damage. Then moving on to the Aetherflow system. This is the second mechanic to Scholar, and the Aetherflow is an ability that you can press once a minute, and it will give you 3 Aetherflow stacks, and those stacks can of course be used on a couple of different skills. First of all, we have Energy Drain. This is a DPS skill because it will deal damage, will also give you some mana back, so it can be pretty useful. For example, if you died, you can just use 1 or 2 Energy Drains to try and get some mana back. Using Aetherflow itself will also grant you some mana back as well, so you definitely want to be using Aetherflow on cooldown as much as possible. Then when it comes down to single target, we have Lustrate. This is a spammable skill, so you can use this 3 times if you have the 3 stacks for it. But we usually don't want to be using Lustrate as much because we do have some other skills that are way better resources spent for those, because Lustrate isn't all that strong. So the second single target one that we have is Cognition, or just Excog for short. And this will be a buff that you place on a party member, usually the tank, and then whenever they drop below half HP, the Excog will trigger and immediately heal them. One very important thing to know about Excog is that this is a heal when they drop below 50%. Now, if a tank gets one shot from 55% to 0 by a tank buster, Excog won't save them. They need to survive the damage first, and then the Excog will trigger, healing them up. Very important to know, because sometimes you'll be like, okay, I gave the tank an Excog and they just died out of nowhere, but that was because they got one shot by a tank buster, for example. So it won't save you from one shots, but still, it's a very good thing to just throw on your tanks so that they will get healed when they drop below that threshold. And last but not least, we also have Indom. This one is an AoE heal, very simple, 30-second cooldown, press it, everybody gets healed. Instant cast heal as well, so very good right there. Oh, I also forgot to mention, we also have Sacred Soil. This is basically a puddle that you, or a bubble more like, that you place on the ground, and as long as people are standing in it, they take reduced damage, so another form of mitigation that we have, and it will also regen those people as long as they are standing in the bubble. Sacred Soil does more healing than Indom does, but of course, Sacred Soil is a heal over time effect, and people also need to stand inside this bubble for them to get healed. So Indom is more like a, if people need to be healed right now because there is another AoE coming, use Indom because it's an instant cast heal. And then, for example, let's mitigate some damage from the raid wide, and then there is, let's say, 20 seconds until the next raid wide happens. Put down the Sacred Soil because it will mitigate the raid wide and then also heal up the rest of your party for the rest of its duration. So usually Sacred Soil is more beneficial when we're looking at like efficiency, but Indom is more likely going to be used when you don't know when the damage is coming out exactly, or when you need a panic AoE heal to get everybody back to full HP for when that raid wide is going to come out. Now, your Aetherflow abilities and your Fairy also kind of work together, because every time that you use an Aetherflow ability, you're also going to be building up your Fairy gauge. Every Aetherflow ability gives you 10 Fairy gauge, and this Fairy gauge can be spent on one of 2 actions. We have the Aether Pact, which will usually be referred to as the Fairy Tether. You basically select one party member, your Fairy will tether that party member, and then they will just constantly heal that party member up as long as you have gauge. Once you run out of gauge, the Fairy will just, of course, stop tethering that person and thus also stop healing them, and then go back to using their Embrace and some other abilities. Very important thing to note, if you summon your Saraf, if you use Whispering Dawn, if you use Fey Illumination, the fairy tether will also break. So if you want them to just keep tethering that one party member, don't execute other fairy actions, or if you are using other fairy actions, make sure you tether that person again once you are done doing those other fairy actions. And then the second one is called Fey Blessing. This is just an Aoe heal. It is on a 1 minute cooldown, which is quite long. The heal is also not as strong as I was kind of hoping it to be for its long cooldown. But basically it only costs you 10 gauge, which is not that much. And it's basically a little bit of an extra Aoe heal that you can use on top of something else, like for example the Whispering Dawn, if Whispering Dawn itself was not enough. Now, important to know is that these two actions, Aether Pact and Fey Blessing, cannot be executed when your Saraf is out. So when the Saraf is out, you use the Saraf abilities. You can still use Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination. They have different names, but they are still available when the Saraf is out. But Aether Pact and Fey Blessing can only be used when the fairy is out and not the Saraf. And then last but not least, when it comes down to healing, we of course need to talk about Recitation. I quickly mentioned it before. This is a great skill because it will do two things for you. First of all, it grants you a free use of Adlo, Succor, Excog or Indom, meaning that you're either going to be saving your mana, because of course Adlo and Succor cost mana, Recitation makes it free so you're not spending the mana, or when you're using Excog or Indom, this is also going to make them free, meaning that they don't use an Aetherflow stack, so that you can use the Aetherflow stack on something else, like for example a Panic Lustrate, or an extra energy drain for some more damage, for some more mana. Now, this isn't the only great thing about Recitation, just making it free, but it will also guarantee that these abilities will crit. So crit Succor, not necessarily the best, but a crit Adlo is still very strong because it grants you that double shield on that one party member. When it comes down to Excog and Indom, those abilities critting can also be very strong. So Recitation, definitely a really strong ability to use. And then last but not least, we also have Dissipation. Now, this is a skill that I personally don't really use all that much because I'm just not a great Scholar player, so I don't know where I can make use of this ability. Basically what it does is it will eat your fairy, that's usually how we refer to it, and then it will grant you 3 Aetherflow stacks and also a healing buff for 30 seconds. Now, whilst you get this 30-second healing buff, your fairy is gone, so your fairy won't be doing that regen, you can't use the fairy actions, you can't summon your Saraf because of course the fairy isn't there. So you can only really make use of this when you don't need to use your fairy for healing, and because I am an inexperienced Scholar, I don't really make use of this all that much. Now, this skill is very good though, because of course it grants you 3 extra Aetherflow stacks, meaning you can use an extra Lustrate, you can use more energy drains, which is what it is usually used for, and of course the 20% healing buff can also be very strong in phases where you need to heal quite a bit. So what you could do is you can use your fairy actions, you for example summon the Saraf, use her shields, then use your Whispering Dawn, your Fey Illumination, and then you're like, okay, I just used all of my fairy skills, it'll take a while for these to come back, let me eat my fairy, get 3 Aetherflow stacks back, and then I can use those Aetherflow stacks with the 20% heal buff on, for example, an Excog to keep the tank alive, or a stronger Indom as well, because we have that 20% healing buff. So definitely a very good tool to use, but it does require a little bit more planning than I am used to, because of course I don't play that much Scholar. Whenever I play healer, it's usually in extreme primals, and that doesn't really require all that much planning. So that's pretty much Scholar. It is a very mitigation focused healer, not so much focused on healing with their global cooldowns, but more interacting with their pet as well as with their Aetherflow mechanic, which is what makes it very interesting to play for me, because you're going to be wanting to plan your actions a whole lot more. You want to be using all of the different off-global cooldown tools that you have before trying to resort to your global cooldowns, which makes Scholars a very satisfying job to play whenever you can heal a full encounter without having to utilize your GCD heals. Also, very quickly, I forgot to mention, we also have a raid buff called Chain Stratagem, and this is basically going to be upping the crit rate that all of your party members have to a specific target, which in most cases is just going to be the boss. So that's pretty much Scholar. Very fun job to play. Definitely not the easiest healer. If you're wanting to get into healer, I would recommend White Mage, because that one is very straightforward, which we'll talk about that one either later this week or maybe early next week. We'll see about that, but definitely a very fun healer indeed. Once you learn all the different tools and you also learn to make use of all of these tools effectively, like for example in the gameplay that you're seeing in the background, I don't really think I use the Recitation all that much. If I were to be a little bit more used to playing Scholar, if I would play the fight a little bit more as well, I would definitely be able to plan out my mitigation, all of my healing tools, a whole lot more as well, and then basically make the run go so much smoother, because having a scholar in your party definitely helps quite a lot with making the run feel a whole lot more comfy. Of course, you can skip out on mitigation to go for more damage, but when it comes down to me playing healer, especially in 8-man content, I try to make it go as smooth as possible. So that's gonna be it for me for today. If you have any questions or opinions on Scholar, then of course feel free to leave those in the comment section down below, and I'll gladly read all of them. But yeah, that's all I had to say for today. So I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.